but that way I suppress some of the coughing. So for me, my talk's going to be more about what happened after going on a trip to Palestine instead of my actual trip to Palestine. I decided to take a trip to Palestine. It was actually the summer of 2010, and I wanted to go to Israel and Palestine. And as a Jewish young person, I had the option of going on Birthright, which, for those who don't know, it's a 2-week delegation. It's basically all paid for. The reason I didn't want to go on that trip is because they only take you where they want you to go. You don't go into the West Bank, you don't meet Palestinians, and you actually don't even see the wall, which is kind of shocking because you go in the West Bank and you don't see an area where you don't see the wall. So I actually decided to pay my own way and go on a delegation that would take me into the West Bank and also into Israel. And so the trip that I decided to go on was an educational trip, and I want to stress, I heard Hatem speak earlier this week, and he had stressed the points that we didn't partake in any protests. There was no political actions that we went to. We didn't even observe them. That was an option for us, and it was like very clear that we were not allowed to partake in any political stuff. The whole purpose of our trip was merely to go and learn about what's happening within the occupation, come back to the United States and report on it at universities like this, and basically share our experience. I was able to do that once before being subpoenaed, and so of course I haven't been able to do it since. But to tell you a little bit about our trip without going into too much detail, we did meet with nonprofit organizations, teachers, nonviolent protesters, and their families. And as this is Women's History Month, and we're talking about women in Palestine, we were actually toured around the West Bank by a women's committee. So the majority of our meetings were specifically with women, which I'll talk about more actually in a little bit. The organizations that we got to meet with focus on farming rights, legal rights, housing rights, and women rights for Palestinians living both in the West Bank and also in Israel. The delegation was organized by a group that's actually being targeted within our investigation called the Palestine Solidarity Group that's here in Chicago. And like Oscar said before, I went on it, I'm Jewish, I went with 2 Palestinian American friends. There was about 6 or 7 of us in the delegation all together. What's interesting is I have no ties family-wise to Israel or the land in Palestine. Unlike me, though, my 2 Palestinian friends do. Their grandparents were born and raised in what now is Israel. And they fled, they lived in Jordan. Their parents were born in Jordan and then came here. And so they were born in the United States. But they have no right to return to Palestine. And yet I have absolutely no ties to this land, and yet I can go for free, which I think is kind of a problem. All 3 of us were nervous about going on this trip, and we didn't know really what we were going to see or encounter. You hear all sorts of stories here in the United States. I was actually nervous about being Jewish and traveling into the West Bank. My mom's entire side of the family is Jewish, and everyone was freaking out that I was going to be traveling in the West Bank. They constantly told me, oh, don't tell any Palestinians you're Jewish, who knows what's going to happen, it's very dangerous. Well, I was, had my mother and my grandmother's voices in my head, so I wasn't eager to tell anyone that I was Jewish. My Palestinian American friends, on the other hand, told every single person that we met with that I was their Jewish friend, and at first I was like, oh my gosh, you guys, come on, calm it down. What actually happened, though, is every time I was introduced as this Jewish girl from Chicago, every single person welcomed me in as I was a family member. It made absolutely no difference. If I think anything, I was given more respect because people were excited in Palestine to see Jewish people going into the West Bank and listening to their stories and meeting them. And they said that that gave them hope as Palestinians to see a Jewish girl with her 2 Palestinian American friends traveling together in Israel and Palestine. Unfortunately, well, and I guess I should mention this too, throughout the West Bank, as my friends and I were traveling with this delegation, we would actually get out of meetings and the 3 of us would kind of wander around. We were in our 20s. And whether it was children playing outside, full families, I've never been invited to so many strangers' home for tea in my life. And And honestly, I probably would have never gone into these homes in any other country, except for in Palestine. It's like so safe, it's crazy. If I was walking down the street in Chicago and people invited me in for tea, there was no way I'd go inside. But for some reason in the West Bank, that is just customary. And you buy something from a shop and you like sit down and you have tea, and it's rude if you do not. And so these stereotypes that I had going in, or these ideas that I had going in, were completely false. Unfortunately, I can't say the same was true for my Palestinian American friends. Their fears were actually not as bad as what the reality became for them. When we first arrived in the Tel Aviv airport, the two of them were detained for 10.5 hours, simply because when the authorities asked what the origin of their name was, and they said, you know, our grandparents are Palestinian, they were immediately red flagged and taken into a separate room. It's interesting because I was actually going up to the immigration people at the same time, and my name's Sarah Smith. It doesn't sound Jewish at all. And so I was asked similar questions, but the question I was asked is, why are you traveling to Israel? You know, you could be in Europe or somewhere. And I said, well, I'm Jewish. And they said, well, Smith isn't a Jewish name. And I said, well, my mom is Jewish, and her last name's Shaneberg. And immediately I was let in. So as my last name lets me get, you know, or my grandparents' last name lets me enter the country, their grandparents' last name actually sends them to a detention room for 10.5 hours. What's interesting is that their entry into Israel was contingent on the two of them, which eventually after 10.5 hours they broke and finally allowed the Israeli officials to do it. But it was contingent on the Israeli officials logging into their personal emails. They had to write down their home address, their home phone numbers, their cell phone numbers. They took all the contacts out of their cell phones. They went through every single thing that they own, that they were bringing with. They unpacked everything, repacked it, scanned everything. But yeah, they went into their personal emails, and what my friend said is they wanted to see if they were planning to do anything illegal or dangerous while in Israel, just because they're Palestinian. So once they finally actually got through, the two girls that I was traveling with said, well, this is to be expected. Our grandparents were forced out of Palestine, and their land was taken over. Israelis don't want Palestinians to return, and so they make it as difficult as possible. They intimidate Palestinians coming from all over the world coming back to Israel because they want you to be scared. They don't want you to come. They want you to hear stories like that so that you think twice before going to Israel. Let's see.